All right, let's just jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating explainer based on visiting Professor Coleman Hughes' recent interview. We're going to map out his highly structured, dialectical approach to history, economics, and race relations. In his university course, which is literally titled The Legacy of Slavery, Hughes challenges his students to look past those super simplified narratives we hear all the time. Instead, he brings this rigorous, multi-perspective framework that puts both conservative and progressive voices in the exact same room. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to look directly at the data, the competing philosophies, and the historical records he relies on to build this whole curriculum. So here's our quick roadmap for today. First, defining the legacy. Second, two views on race. Third, global historical context. Fourth, wealth and the 1619 Project. Fifth, family structure shifts. And finally, number 6, the path forward. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Defining the Legacy, History versus Modern Impact. So Hughes starts by asking his students to do something pretty tough. Untangle the actual dry timeline of historical slavery from its alleged legacy today. By calling the course The Legacy of Slavery, he's essentially forcing them to figure out, okay, what are actual long-term consequences here and what, well, just isn't. To do this, he lays out two totally competing schools of thought. On one hand, you have the maximalist view. This is the side hunting for historical fingerprints in modern life, assuming things like the modern prison system are a direct, undeniable extension of historical white supremacy. On the flip side, you've got the minimalist view. This instinct treats modern issues as completely independent phenomena, arguing that things like mass incarceration actually kicked off in the 1970s because of completely different systemic reasons and, frankly, bad incentives. Hughes doesn't tell them what to think. He just takes a really evidence-based, case-by-case approach, prompting everyone to find that dialectical truth somewhere between the two extremes. Moving right along to Section 2, Two Views on Race, the Civil Rights Philosophical Divide. You know, if we really want to understand where our modern political discourse comes from, we've got to look back at the competing philosophical movements that blew up during and right after the Civil Rights era. Hughes argues we're dealing with two fundamentally incompatible frameworks here. You have Dr. King's desire to integrate into what he saw as a fundamentally good society, completely juxtaposed against the 1970s Black Power movement's belief that neutral institutions are just a total illusion. As the source material outlines, the critical race theory movement, spearheaded by folks like Derek Bell, explicitly rejected the original civil rights movement's goals. They argued, hey, there's no such thing as a race-neutral standard, meaning the existing systems literally have to be torn down from the ground up rather than just welcoming everybody inside. The interview really anchors its whole analysis on this incredibly famous sentiment: treat people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Hughes asserts that this original classical liberal ideal actually contradicts a lot of modern race-centric philosophies. He points out that Dr. King repeatedly pushed for class-based, not race-based policies. In fact, King specifically critiqued the Black Power movement in his final book over this exact issue. By looking objectively at the text, the source emphasizes that King's vision of transcending race is just vastly different from modern movements that want to place racial identity right at the absolute center of American life. Okay, zooming out now for Section 3, Global Historical Context, Expanding the Lens. Here, the explainer pulls back the lens, leaning on economist Thomas Sowell's research to look at the sheer scale of global data. And honestly, this provides context you almost never see in standard curriculums. By mapping out these historical facts, the source argues that zeroing in exclusively on American slavery creates this kind of distorted psychological narrative. But when you look at the global picture, it reveals that unchecked power has historically led literally all groups to exploit others. Sowell highlights that slavery was, tragically, a universal fact of human existence. It wasn't just invented in the Americas. It was deeply entrenched in Africa for thousands of years, in the Arab empires, and even the Ottoman Empire, which enslaved millions of white Europeans. It's a heavy realization, but an absolutely crucial one for context. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, the crucial point Hughes makes is that the moral realization that slavery is actually wrong was a uniquely Enlightenment value. If we trace the timeline from the 1860s to the 1880s, the West, starting with Britain and America, really birthed this foundational abolitionist sentiment. The source makes a fascinating point. The very ideals written into the American Declaration of Independence created a massive forcing mechanism of hypocrisy. I mean, think about it. You can't declare all men are created equal while simultaneously holding slaves without creating immense societal friction. And that exact friction? That is what eventually led to mass emancipation globally. Let's pivot to economics in Section 4, Wealth and the 1619 Project, economic realities. All right, this is where things get really interesting. We're testing the massive economic claim, popularized heavily by the 1619 Project, that America's national wealth was directly built on the back of slavery. Now, the new history of capitalism points out that slave-picked cotton made up half of American exports. Sounds huge, right? But Hughes contextualizes this by pointing out that exports overall only accounted for 6% of the economy. That means slave-picked cotton was actually just 3% of the total national economy. 3%. Now, obviously, 3% is not zero, but the source argues it's a far cry from being the fundamental engine of America's wealth. To put that into perspective, look at countries like Egypt or India back then. They also had vast amounts of cheap or slave-picked cotton, but they never experienced anything close to an American-style economic boom. Which leads us to a pretty counterintuitive question. Did slavery actually hinder economic growth rather than create national wealth? To figure this out, the source applies what's called the Sowell growth model. This model argues that real national wealth comes from things like property rights, stable laws, and innovation. Slavery actively disrupted all of those things by causing wars and terrifying away investment. Economists know that capital, free labor, and innovation are the actual building blocks of wealthy nations. The interview points out that slavery deterred outside investment because of the constant threat of insurrection, and it fundamentally discouraged free, skilled labor from ever moving down into the South. Let's look at a really concrete historical case to prove this. If you compare land on the free labor side of the Ohio River with literally identical land right across the water on the slave labor side in Kentucky, you get this perfect natural historical experiment. Because identical land was legal for slavery in Kentucky but illegal in Ohio, you can just compare them head to head. And the data shows that land in the free state was utilized far more productively and held significantly higher value. The free side attracted more people, more innovation, just way better land utilization across the board. The conclusion the source draws is that mass emancipation events historically accelerate economic growth, simply because free people have the actual incentive to build. All right, shifting gears to sociology. Section 5, Family Structure Shifts, the Moynihan Report. So, moving from economics over to sociology, the interview dives into the highly sensitive topic of changing family structures, specifically referencing the famous 1965 Moynihan Report. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously warned that the rising rate of single-parent households was going to completely undercut the legal victories of the civil rights movement. Just look at these metrics from 1965 compared to today. Single-parent homes in the Black community sat at about 25% back then. Today, that number has skyrocketed to roughly 66%. And we see a massive leap in the white community, too, jumping from 5% to over 30%. Moynihan saw this writing on the wall and warned that civil rights legislation alone just couldn't fix a structural collapse of the family unit. So what actually caused this massive societal shift? Well, Hughes attributes this not necessarily to a lingering legacy of slavery, but to changing market dynamics in the 1970s. Drawing on the work of economist George Akerlof, the source explains that before the 70s, the shotgun marriage was a pretty universal cultural norm. But once birth control and abortion became widely accessible, the underlying game theory of the dating market totally changed. Women could no longer uniformly demand marriage in exchange for affection. That upfront leverage basically evaporated overnight, which entirely altered family formation across all demographics. Though, as the data shows, it definitely hit some communities a lot harder and faster than others. And finally, bring it all home with Section 6, The Path Forward, Optimism and Solutions. Despite all this heavy historical and statistical baggage we've just unpacked, Hughes actually outlines a super optimistic vision for the future of American race relations and education. And get this, he points to AI as a major solution. He argues that as younger generations increasingly turn to large language models for information, they're likely getting a much fairer, far less politicized view of history than they'd ever get from traditional human institutions. Now, obviously, no system is perfectly unbiased, right? But the source argues that LLMs are broadly a net good. Compared to heavily politicized legacy media, or biased professors, or, let's be real, toxic social media threads, AI models tend to provide a much more balanced, dialectical summary of history, especially as intense market competition forces these platforms to stay accountable and relatively neutral. Hughes wraps up his framework with this really structured three-step formula for achieving actual racial progress, rooted in the idea that children are naturally colorblind unless we actively program them to be otherwise. Step 1, the source argues we need to implement strictly colorblind laws to stop this endless cyclical wheel of group grievances. Step 2, we have to foster colorblind education, leaning heavily into that natural innocence of kids and reinforcing a culture of judging people by their character rather than hyperfixating on racial differences. And step 3, we need to build a strong, growth-focused economy with low unemployment. Why? Because a booming economy naturally acts like a massive pressure release valve, inherently lowering societal tensions across the board. As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. How can we best achieve a unified society moving forward while objectively understanding the complexities of our history without weaponizing it? If we can actually apply this multi-perspective approach to our past, looking honestly at the data, acknowledging the global context, and prioritizing fundamentally fair systems, we might just find that the path to unity is a whole lot brighter than the current narrative wants us to believe. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Take this question with you and keep seeking out the objective truths behind the headlines.